On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews. We take a look at Nick Paul.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. On today's episode of Locked On Lightning, we are discussing Nick Paul. As some of you know, if you're tuning in for the first time and you have no idea what we're doing off-season player reviews. Please go ahead and go back to them. We have a whole playlist on our YouTube page that is dedicated to that. So if you want to go back, watch those episodes or listen to them, they're also available wherever podcasts are distributed, and they are distributed free. So we're looking at Nick Paul, and very interesting. Nick Paul is one of those players where, and maybe some Lightning fans may agree with me, where he's 28 years old, but at least in my eyes, and maybe this is just because he's completed his first full season with the team, it feels like we just saw his rookie season play out. I get when kind of reflecting on Nick Paul's season, kind of similar in terms of like what we saw when he was brought in 21-22, and he was able to contribute right away. He threw 21 games, 14 points, 5 goals, and I'm sorry, 20. I think I said 21 games, 14 points. Yeah, I said that. Just making sure I don't misspeak. And then he has a phenomenal playoffs, and then he has a very good, I think, for a third line forward, very good year with the Tampa Bay Lightning, first full year. It kind of reminds me, and I'm not saying that this is a comparison in terms of performance or potential or whatever you would like to take from this statement, but it gives me kind of like the same vibes in terms of excitement, optimism that we saw from when Ross Colton first was playing with the Lightning. As you may or may not remember, during the shortened season, Ross Colton came up. He played only 9 games during that regular season, but the playoffs is when he really broke out in a big way, especially Game 5 in the Stanley Cup Final to clinch the series for the Lightning against Montreal. And then following that season, had a very phenomenal season. And that's kind of how I feel with him. I kind of feel like just the excitement, just the newness of him playing with this team. It's very exciting towards Lightning fans because it's almost as if they got a player who I firmly believe, since he just signed a long-term contract not too long ago with this team, there's still a lot of potential that I think that he has. I still think that there's a lot in his game that he is still developing. I still think that he is going to be one of the big time leaders in the next couple of years, especially as we maybe start to see some players either age out or just not continue their tenures with this team. And I think when we look back on the Nick Paul trade and just the games that he's played in thus far afterwards, I think we could say that that is probably going to go down as one of the better trades in the franchise history. Now, obviously, he's only played one full season, but when you look at his sample, the sample that he's been able to provide with Tampa Bay Lightning through a little over 100 games, 101 games, 22 goals, 46 points. 22 of those are goals. And I'm reiterating that because I think that's very important. I think that, and this is going to be a constant topic on this podcast, really, for the foreseeable future. Because as if you were been a listener of this show for quite some time, I am as equally, if not more, worried about the Lightning's future as I am about what is going on right now in the present time. And I think that what it boils down to is that, yeah, we could all sit here and enjoy the success that this team is having. But at the end of the day, unless they're winning cups, they really need to be where we really need to also keep an eye on the future. Because, even regardless if, they're winning cups, there is going to be a day there when the well is going to run dry in terms of being able to slide someone in, whether it be at the trade deadline or bring someone up from Syracuse. And I think that when the Lightning look at their future, like they already clearly have, I think that Nick Paul is a huge part of that future. Now, looking back at his regular season, his first full regular season really with this team, 80 games, 17 goals, 32 points. That's all going really mostly playing on the second line, but, playing here and there on the third line. I think he had, by all intents and purposes, and really, just how this team performed overall, he was a huge part of that. I think he had a phenomenal season for what was asked of him. And I also think, having said that and looking at his stats, I don't think that his stats tell the whole story. I think when you look at Nick Paul, and this is not really a comparison side by side, but if you're gonna look at Nick Paul's numbers and measure him maybe against past players that have had a boatload of success on this team, and besides the fact that this guy is very good in the faceoff circle, which is a whole nother thing that I am absolutely ecstatic about that he brings to the table. He does everything. And when you look at him, whether it be on the stat sheet or off the stat sheet, just doing a little bit of everything, I look at guys like Blake Coleman. I look at Barclay Goodrow, maybe more so Barclay Goodrow, because I feel like him and Paul are much more closer in size. So, and we had this conversation, I think, last offseason, what is Nick Paul? And I've definitely spoken about it here and there throughout the course of the season this year. Because obviously the biggest talking point with this Lightning team, surrounding this team ever since Goodrow, Gord, and Coleman left, was how are you going to fill those spots? And Lightning did that partially last year by bringing in Nick Paul. I still think that, we really can't measure the success of this third line against that third line, because when you look at that third line of Gord, Coleman, and Paul, Coleman, and Goodrow, you can't really, that we're talking about one of the best third lines in probably the last 20 years. And if you don't agree with me, if you're Lightning or not, look at how big of an effect that they had on the Lightning, not only winning one cup, but winning 2 consecutive cups. So, and then you also, really, that was it's a good measuring point, though, in terms of being able to see what is the right recipe for at least this team. It may not work out as well with other teams, but at least for the way this Lightning team is built, the best thing you could do is just go for guys that could do a little bit of everything, and that may not be an out of the box idea or statement there, but I think that Nick Paul is probably the closest thing you're ever going to get for the foreseeable future in terms of being able to do a little bit of everything on that third line. And he really is the anchor of that third line forward position. Quite frankly, I think that he belongs on the second line. I would probably doubt that we're going to see him get moved up to the second line, and unless John Cooper is maybe desperate to, maybe because of the exit of Alex Killorn or an injury happening on the second line. But I think at the end of the day, it would also be kind of a waste to get him out of that center position because of just how well he plays down the middle and how big of a weapon he is for this Lightning team down the middle, and throw him on the forward position on the wing. But I think that in the long term, because as I've stated, and I'm sure you've heard on other outlets, other places that cover the Tampa Bay Lightning, there's not a lot coming up to save this team in the foreseeable future from within. The Lightning are going to look on the outside to kind of fill the holes here and there if they can, if salary cap permitting. Now, the issue is obviously, I mean, really, it's not an issue. It's more so probably the philosophy that this team is going to have to go forward is develop within. And the best way you could do that is stick players who are kind of on the borderline, or those that you do see potential in playing well, is stick them with players that can do a little bit of everything, like a Nick Paul. And as of now this idea may change because, like I've stated multiple times on this show, that the Lightning, things could change very drastically, especially if whatever happens with the Alex Killorn deal. Like I've stated multiple times, Alex Killorn could sign. It may not be for a lot. Then again, I've seen reports that he could potentially get a contract elsewhere for in the $6 million range AAV, which is insane. I mean, I'm very curious as to who's going to be paying that contract, because it definitely won't be the Lightning. If he does stay and somehow get that deal, the Lightning are going to have to 100% trade Ross Colton. Now that leaves Nick Paul without a line mate. But I think that for the short term, Lightning fans should be very excited, not only for the foreseeable future to see what Nick Paul can do, but what kind of leader that he is going to evolve into, especially with some of the changes that may very well happen this offseason. So tune in for that, and we'll obviously keep track of it all as it develops, because I really think that, and I firmly believe, as much as I was on the Ross Colton train last year coming into the season, and very disappointing season for Ross Colton, I hope I hope things turn out different for Nick Paul, because I am very much on the Nick Paul train. I think that he is one of the vital parts. As we all know what we're going to get out of Point and Cooch. We now have an idea what to expect out of Hagel. Cirelli is going to be Cirelli. Nick Paul now needs to step up and I think replicate, if not try and outdo his past season, because that could very well determine how far the Lightning do get into the playoffs and if they could get back to the Stanley Cup Final. So we'll keep an eye on that. And of course, over the course of this episode, we'll be discussing more about Nick Paul. Has the best yet to come? Are we going to see more out of this guy, or is 32 points really the threshold that we should now expect from him? We'll talk about that as well. But first, I want to talk about our friends over at eBay Motors. Now, if you haven't heard about eBay Motors, well, listen up. A championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. So for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check, because just like Nick Paul being the right fit for this Lightning team, you definitely got to make sure that all the parts fit, and the Lightning will be making a lot of decisions this offseason, seeing who could fit, who doesn't fit, and they definitely want to do it for the right price. So stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit, ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available in U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. So if you're joining us now, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We are available on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel. Like I've said multiple times, and I will continue to say until it actually happens, once we hit the 1,000 subscription mark on our YouTube page, we will be doing a lottery, I guess, or a raffle. And the prize will be a signed Vincent LeCavier Lightning puck. So you definitely want to be a part of that and hit that notification bell, because as soon as more information around that drops, as soon as we hit 1,000 subscriptions, you definitely don't want to miss that and be part of that. As well as, just the news that we continue to talk about as the Lightning's summer continues to unfold. They signed Sean Day the other day. Great. Played 2 games for the Lightning this past year. Don't really expect him to be a big part of their plans going forward. If Sean Day's in the starting lineup next year on opening night, I would be very concerned. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Right now, we're talking about Nick Paul, who, in my opinion, really is, and maybe I'm just, I don't know. I'll admit I haven't given him his due throughout the course of the season. Really a big part to the success of this Lightning team throughout the course of the season. And really a guy that I think a lot of players on this team gravitated to relatively easy. Now it's easy to get guys to like you, especially when you're new to an environment, when you're playing well and you're the reason why they're winning games. And you look at his stats, like I said, just to recap from this past year's first full year with the Tampa Bay Lightning, through 80 games, 17 goals, 32 assists, 4 game-winning goals, 4 power play goals, 1 shorthanded. Guy who I think can very well be sustainable in doing everything. And, really the question is now, because if you look at his numbers prior to coming to Tampa, not really a big point getter, a guy who, when he came in, guy that we all knew was going to be able to do a little bit of everything. Now, if you want to look at his time that year that was split between Ottawa and Tampa Bay, he did have 32 points that season as well. Whether I don't know how you want to read into that, because it's just it's Jekyll and Hyde, because Ottawa wasn't very good. Tampa Bay, of course, making their third straight trip to the Stanley Cup Final. So, opposite ends of the NHL pyramid of success, I guess, if you want to call it. But now we got to ask ourselves, because you kind of see this with certain players that go from not so good situations where they don't really have good players around them, or just the team is not succeeding around them, and their numbers kind of suffer because of that. And then they go to a team like a Tampa Bay. You ask yourself, are they going to be able to replicate this, or are they more a victim of circumstance? And that goes both ways, I think, the victim of circumstance thing, because when you look at a player, you can make the argument for both. If their numbers aren't good, is it because their team is bad? Now, if they're playing in a market or for a franchise that is very good, that is constantly going to the playoffs every year, that is constantly at the top of the NHL um, pecking order in terms of very good teams. You could say, okay, that's not really a good player. But if you get a player whose numbers kind of jump, as Nick Paul's did uh, during the 21-22 season, one can make the case, well, he is a victim of circumstance because the players around him are much better. But I think that when we look at Nick Paul's performance, and yes, it was a very short sample size. If you look at his performance through those 21 games that he played for the Tampa Bay Lightning in 21-22, as opposed to the full season that he played in 22-23, I think the one major difference, and this even goes for his performance that we saw during the playoffs, is that he's a lot more confident. And like I said, or at least alluded to in the first part of this episode, was that I think that a lot of players like him. He's one of the more likable players, I think, on this team. You could just, not saying that, you could just tell by the way guys just gravitate towards him, the way guys do talk about him. I think that if he hasn't done already, and you could tell, I think, in my opinion, just the way he talks to the media and the way he presents himself. He might seem soft spoken, but at the same time, I think on the ice, you could tell he is one of the leaders. And I think that is going to play a key factor. And I also think that his ability to do a little bit of everything is going to allow him that versatility, especially if Alex Killorn is not with us in the beginning of 23-24. I think we're going to see a lot more flexibility from John Cooper to move him up to the second line. Now, it's not going to be an every game thing. It might be at certain points throughout the course of games, depending on whether or not John Cooper feels like that is going to be a good fit. Like I've already stated, I would rather keep him on the third line, but one can't help but wonder what a line of Paul, Cirelli, and Stamkos would be, because if you've watched the Brandon Hagel episode, when we did a player review on him, I strictly said that Brandon Hagel should be on the first line and Steven Stamkos should be on the second, if not the third line. Now, that does raise an interesting question as well, because at the end of the day, this could also, it goes back to the whole victim of circumstance thing. It also depends who Nick Paul has around him. Now, if we're talking about opening night, which if I'm John Cooper, I'm going to have Nick Paul down the middle, Esamon on the wing, and you have Steven Stamkos on the other wing. And then on that second line, you have Cirelli. I would even put Colton there. I think that you need to jumpstart him, and that the only way you could do that is if you throw him on the second line. I mean, the combinations, and maybe we'll do an episode on this soon, but the combinations are endless as to what we could do with this team, because a lot of guys on this team, I think, are flexible. And I think that Nick Paul definitely could play anywhere. I could actually see Nick Paul, because the case can be made, if you don't want to put Hagel up front, but you don't want Stamkos on the first line, I say throw Cirelli on the first line. Then you could throw Nick Paul on that second line. And you have a very good center right there. But then obviously, you leave yourself shorthand on that third line. But I think that really, and I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole of line combinations, which I love and I hate doing because it sidetracks me from really what we want to talk about. Really, when we look at Nick Paul and we look at his upcoming season and we look at his skill set, now I'm not at a point, and I don't think this is at any point going to be a factor, but for the most part, he's healthy. He stays healthy. He plays the game the right way, and he plays the game he's just a sturdy player, really. And I think that we're going to see at least an 80 game season out of him. I would prefer if he plays all 82. I would, and maybe this is more so wishful thinking, but I would venture to say that it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that Nick Paul has a 20-goal season this year. And if that is the case, if he has a 20-goal season and let's say maybe a 35, 40-point season, I think that's phenomenal. I think that's really a great season for a player like that who, he's not a first-line player, but I think that he's definitely a second-line player, second-line forward. I mean, anytime you get 20 goals out of your center that is not named Connor McDavid or, insert superstar center that could score a lot, that is a phenomenal season. And I think that if Nick Paul could get to that 20-goal threshold, I think that some of the holes that this Lightning team may have, at least during the regular season, they could live with. We're not going to talk about playoffs because that is like completely more than a year away from even being in question. I'm more concerned about the regular season because I think that where the Lightning are right now compared to some other teams in the division, like Boston, who is pretty much on the way out in terms of divisional supremacy, Florida, who could very well suffer a post-Cup final hangover, especially the way they're getting their butts kicked, and Ottawa and Montreal really not being non-factors until they are this season. And then Toronto just being kind of a question mark, in my opinion, because you never know with these teams. They're going to be under a ton of scrutiny. I still think that this is the Lightning's division for the taking. And I firmly believe that if we could see more of an offensive output from Nick Paul, because we're going to see, and this is under the assumption that we're going to see everything else that we normally get from him. But if Nick Paul could go out there, put up 20 goals, maybe even more, maybe at that point we're being a little selfish. But if he could go out there, put up 20 goals down the middle, still have over 50% in the faceoff circle, put up 35 to 40 points, I would venture to say, as long as everybody else plays well around him, the Lightning win the Atlantic Division. So, wrapping things up on the show, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed. And yeah, tell me what you think about Nick Paul. Expectations that you have for him. My expectations, more so maybe wishful thinking, is 20 goals, 35 points, maybe 40. If you ain't getting better, what are you doing wrong? Is how I look at it. He has showed a steady progression since he's gotten here, and that's through 101 games. So really not a big sample size, but I still think that he has a good team around him where I don't think the pressure is on him yet. I don't think he plays with pressure. I don't think that he is a player on this team that needs to feel pressure. As long as he comes in, plays the way he normally plays this year, that we've seen him the last year and a half, I think that there is that potential that he could become really one of the better players on this team if he hasn't been already. I think this year, definitely he got his name out more. I think a lot more teams and players, opposing players, definitely noticed him more if they didn't during the previous playoffs. I just am hoping that we don't see, like I made my comparison to him and Ross Colton, kind of just how everything kind of feels new still with Nick Paul. I just hope that we don't see that hangover. Because just like I just got done talking about how if Nick Paul puts up the numbers that I expect of him, which is 20 goals, 35 to 40 points, the Lightning could easily win the division. But if Nick Paul comes out and just completely falls flat this year, it's going to be a very difficult year. And unless the Lightning pick it up all around this year, if we see somewhat of a replica season from them from last year, as we saw that, in this season, I think it's going to be very rough. I think that, as much as the division is up for the taking, I still think that if the Lightning, if they come out and they don't play the right way, and we see somewhat of the same in terms of regular season performance from them, listen, we could be sitting here in February, maybe even sooner, starting to stress over them possibly not making the playoffs. The East is that competitive. And I firmly believe that really, I'm not saying all the pressure's on him. I firmly believe, though, that he is a big piece of this team's success. And I'm expecting big things from Nick Paul in the 2023-24 season. So please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Hit us up on our social media pages at @LO_Lightning on Twitter, as well as LockedOn_Lightning on Instagram. You could give me a follow at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK. Stay tuned for as we drop more player reviews throughout the course of this week and as the weeks go on. And yeah, keep an eye on that Stanley Cup Final. Can't wait to see who wins. Hopefully Florida could kind of come back and make this somewhat of an exciting series. I don't want to see Vegas sweep. Root for Florida hockey. Don't root against the Panthers because they're our rivals. But we'll keep an eye on that as well. We'll be talking about that maybe later on in the week. So keep an eye on that. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.